My name is Renata Voss. I am 33 years old. And the afternoon my father typed 11 words into a family group chat was the afternoon I finally understood that being disowned by people who depend on you is a very different thing from being free of them. It was a Tuesday in early March. I was at my desk finishing a quarterly summary when my phone lit up with a notification I did not recognize at first. A group chat called Our Family had added me. I assumed it was a mistake. I opened it to remove myself and saw the message thread already running. My father's message was near the top of the new activity, timestamped 2:14 p.m. As far as I'm concerned, she's not family anymore. We raised a stranger. My mother had replied with one word. Agreed. My brother Daniel had sent a thumbs up. My Aunt Cecile, my mother's older sister, had written, "Some people just don't appreciate what they were given." There were 6 other family members in the chat. None of them had pushed back. I read the thread twice. Then I set my phone face down on the desk and finished the paragraph I had been typing. When I picked the phone back up 3 minutes later, I did not open the group chat again. I opened my contacts, scrolled to a name I had not needed in 14 months, and sent a single text. "I need to discuss the property situation. Are you available this week?" Her name was Margaret Osei. She was a real estate attorney. And what she and I needed to discuss was the fact that the house my parents had lived in for the past 4 years, the house where my father had typed that message on a Tuesday afternoon from the kitchen table, was owned entirely by me. What none of them had thought to check, in all the time they had spent deciding I was not worth keeping, was whose name was on the deed. I need to go back to explain the house because the house did not begin as a weapon or a contingency. It began as a solution to a problem my family had created and could not solve on their own. My parents immigrated from Eastern Germany in the mid-1980s and spent the first decade in the country working jobs that paid adequately but offered nothing in the way of accumulation. By the time I was in school, they had stabilized into a modest, functional life. My father worked as a shift supervisor at a logistics facility. My mother worked part-time at a dental office, and we lived in a rented duplex on a street that flooded mildly every spring. The stability was real, but it was the kind that required everything to go right simultaneously and had no cushion for anything going wrong. My brother Daniel was born 4 years after me and absorbed a disproportionate share of what my parents had to give. This is not a complaint. It is a description. Daniel was the one my father coached in youth soccer on Saturday mornings. Daniel was the one whose school conferences my mother attended wearing her good coat. Daniel was the one whose friends came over after school and filled the kitchen with noise that my parents treated as proof the house was alive. I was the one who did homework at the table while all of this happened around me, who took the bus to my part-time job at 16 without being asked, who applied to colleges with no help navigating the process, and got into a state school on a partial academic scholarship. I do not think my parents made a deliberate choice to organize the family this way. I think it happened gradually, through 100 small decisions that each seemed reasonable in the moment, and that by the time any of us could have named the pattern, it had become invisible through repetition. I was the capable one. I was the one who handled things. This was understood by everyone, including me, as a neutral fact rather than as something that cost me specifically. I studied finance. I took a position at a mid-sized investment advisory firm at 22 and spent the next several years building a career with the same quiet competence I had applied to everything else. I was not flashy. I was precise. I kept detailed records, and I understood, professionally and personally, that the only reliable way to know the shape of something was to measure it over time. My parents never asked about my work in specific terms. When Daniel launched a landscaping business at 26, my father talked about it at every Sunday dinner for 4 months. When I received a promotion that came with a significant salary adjustment, I mentioned it once, and my mother said that was nice and asked if Daniel had called to let anyone know about his new truck. I kept a record of this too. Not out of bitterness. Out of habit. The house came about because of a crisis in 2020, when my father's logistics facility reduced staffing and his hours dropped by 40% over 3 months. The duplex lease was coming up for renewal, and the new rate was higher than the old one by an amount that, combined with the income reduction, created a gap my parents could not bridge without depleting what little savings they had. Daniel was 27 at the time, and his landscaping business was not profitable enough to provide meaningful assistance. I was 29 and had been building savings steadily for 7 years. My father called me on a Thursday evening and explained the situation in the clipped, practical way he explained most things, as a logistics problem, not an emotional one. He said they were looking at options. I asked what kind of options. He said they were possibly looking at moving to a smaller unit farther from the city, which would mean my mother commuting longer to her job and my father losing access to the transit line that connected him to most available work. I listened. Then I said I would look into some numbers and call back. I spent the following weekend running figures. The property market in their neighborhood had a reasonable entry point at that time, and mortgage rates were favorable. My own financial position, salary, savings, credit profile, was strong enough that I could qualify for a purchase without difficulty. I could buy a property outright as the owner of record, carry the mortgage myself, and allow my parents to live there at a monthly amount below market rate that they could manage. The arrangement would give them stability, build equity that I held, and cost me approximately the difference between what I would collect and what I paid, a manageable monthly gap. I called my father back on Sunday and laid out the structure. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said it seemed like a reasonable solution. My mother got on the line and said it would be a relief. Neither of them asked about the legal structure in detail. I told them the property would be in my name, that I would carry the mortgage, and that they would pay me a below-market monthly rent. My father said that was fine. I hired Margaret Osei to handle the purchase. The transaction closed in November of that year. I became the owner of record of a 3-bedroom house on a quiet street 11 minutes from my parents' previous neighborhood. They moved in on a Saturday in December, and my father put up a wreath on the door, and my mother cooked the first dinner in the new kitchen, and nobody said anything about the fact that the house belonged to me. Over the following 4 years, my parents paid rent consistently, not because the amount was unmanageable, but because my father was a precise man about the things he decided to be precise about, and this was one of them. The monthly transfer arrived within 2 days of the first of each month without exception. I noted this. I applied it toward the mortgage and maintained the property account as I would any asset. What changed over those same 4 years was not the financial arrangement. What changed was the texture of my relationship with my family. I cannot trace it to a single moment. It was more like a slow reclassification, the way water finds new channels after something shifts underground. Daniel got married in 2021, and his wife Elena had strong opinions about family structure, chief among them being that Daniel's sister was not contributing enough to the family in a relational sense and was too focused on her own life to show up the way family should. I learned this framing not through a direct conversation, but through the things people said around me and stopped saying when I entered the room. My mother began aligning with Elena's assessments in small, habitual ways, agreeing at Sunday dinners that yes, it was hard when people in a family were not emotionally present, that some people just had a different orientation. My father, who had never been given to expressions of sentiment in either direction, began directing his approvals and his table conversation almost exclusively at Daniel and Elena, as if the three of them had formed a smaller family within the family and I was now adjacent to it rather than part of it. I attended Sunday dinners. I came to the gatherings. I transferred the rent payment on the 2nd of every month. And I watched the reclassification happen around me with the same careful attention I brought to any data set that was developing in a direction I had not predicted. In January of the year before the group chat, Elena had a baby, a daughter they named Sophie. The announcement came through Daniel as if it were a press release. I sent a gift. I was not invited to the hospital. When I attended the first family gathering after Sophie came home, Elena held the baby at the center of the room and accepted congratulations from my parents and Aunt Cecile while I sat at the edge of the conversation and ate a plate of food and watched my father touch the baby's hand with an expression on his face I had not seen directed at me since I was small. I drove home that evening and updated a document I had been keeping, not a financial spreadsheet this time, but a plain text file where I recorded events and dates. I had started it 2 years earlier, not with any specific purpose in mind, but because I am someone who measures things over time, and I had begun to understand that the shape of what was happening would only be legible if I had been tracking it long enough. By February, the document was 41 entries. The group chat happened on a Tuesday in early March, as I said, and my father's message was not the first entry on the thread. The chat had been active since the previous Saturday. I scrolled back through 6 days of messages. The thread had started as logistics for Sophie's 3-month gathering, which was being organized at my parents' house for the following weekend. Guest list, food assignments, timing. My name did not appear in any planning discussion. On Sunday, my mother had asked about the seating arrangement, and Daniel had replied, "Just plan for the usual people." Elena had replied, "The living room fits everyone easily if it's just family." My Aunt Cecile had replied, "Perfect." No one had mentioned inviting me. On Monday, my Aunt Cecile had sent a longer message that I read twice. It said, in summary, that the gathering was going to be lovely and that it was a shame that some people in a family chose distance over connection, and that it was nobody's fault when a person simply didn't prioritize the people who had given them everything. She did not use my name. She did not need to. My father's message on Tuesday had come in response to a message from Daniel asking whether to order extra chairs from the neighbor. My father had replied about the chairs and then added, apparently as a continuation of a conversation that had been running for days in the subtext, "As far as I'm concerned, she's not family anymore. We raised a stranger." My mother had replied, "Agreed." My brother had sent a thumbs up. I had been added to the chat 4 minutes after my father's message by my Aunt Cecile, who sent me a follow-up text 2 minutes later that read, "Renata, you've been added to the family chat so you can see what's being planned." She had either not scrolled up far enough to see what she had added me into, or she had, and this was intentional. I have thought about this question for a long time, and I do not have a definitive answer. I lean toward carelessness. But I have noted that carelessness and intention can sometimes produce the same outcome. I sat at my desk and looked at my phone for approximately 4 minutes. My hand was flat on the desk beside the keyboard, very still. Then I opened my contacts and texted Margaret Osei. Margaret called me back within the hour. She is a deliberate woman. She listens before she speaks, and she asks the question she actually wants answered rather than a version of it that sounds softer. When I had finished explaining the situation, she said, "And the property is still titled solely in your name?" I said yes. She said, "And the lease arrangement, do you have a written lease?" I said no. We had operated on a verbal understanding and monthly transfers, which I had documented, but which had never been formalized in a written agreement. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is actually relevant. Without a formal lease, the tenancy classification defaults to month under the state statute. That gives you more flexibility than a fixed-term agreement would." I said I understood. She asked what I wanted to accomplish. I told her I was not certain yet, but that I wanted my parents to understand the structure of the arrangement they were living inside, the one they had never asked about in detail for years ago when I had explained it to my father, and he had said that seems fine, and hung up the phone to watch Daniel's soccer recap. Margaret said she could draft a formal notice, not an eviction, she was careful to say, but a formal notification of tenancy terms and a request for written acknowledgement of the ownership structure, which would establish the legal record clearly and require my parents to respond in writing. She said it would go out on her firm's letterhead. She said my father would understand immediately what it meant. I told her to send it on Friday. She sent it on Friday at 11:47 a.m. My father called me at 11:52. I let it ring. He called again at 12:04, then at 12:19, then at 12:31, a gap that suggested he had called someone else in between, Daniel, most likely, and then called me again when that conversation did not resolve anything. At 12:44, my mother called. I let that ring as well. At 1:15, Daniel called. I picked up. He said, "Renata, what is happening?" "Dad just got a letter from a lawyer." I said, "I know." I asked her to send it. There was a silence. "Then why?" I said, "Because Dad typed on Tuesday that I am not family anymore." I thought it was reasonable for him to have a formal reminder of the arrangement he's been living inside. Daniel said, That wasn't meant for you to see." I said, "I know." He said, "So you're going to evict them? Over a text message?" I said, "The letter is not an eviction notice. It's a tenancy notification. Margaret's contact information is at the bottom if Dad wants to discuss the formal terms." He said, "Margaret." I said, "My attorney." There was another silence. I heard him exhale. the specific exhale of someone recalculating something they thought they had already settled. He said, "I didn't know you had an attorney." I said, "There are a few things about my life that didn't come up at Sunday dinners." He didn't reply to that immediately. Then he said, "Renata, there are parents." I said, "I know who they are, Daniel." He said, Can you just not do anything until we talk?" I said, "I'm not doing anything." I sent a letter. If Dad wants to respond through Margaret, she's available Monday through Thursday. I ended the call. My father called 6 more times before 4 o'clock. At 4:17, he sent a text. It was the first direct text my father had sent me in 11 weeks, which I know because I had been tracking my own document. The text read, "Renata, we should talk. Please call me." I looked at it for a moment. Then I put the phone in my desk drawer and finished my workday. That evening I made dinner and sat at my own kitchen table and read through the tenancy notification Margaret had sent me a copy of. It was 2 pages. The first page established the ownership record, property address, title holder, date of acquisition, assessed value as of the most recent county filing at $387,000. The second page outlined the month-to-month tenancy structure, the below-market rent history, and the request for written acknowledgement of terms within 30 days. Margaret's name and the firm's address were at the bottom. It was a precise document. It named things accurately. It did not editorialize. I thought about my father sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where he had typed his message on Tuesday afternoon, reading a document that laid out, in formal language on a law firm's letterhead, the structure of the thing he had been living inside for 4 years without fully examining. I thought about the moment he reached the assessed value line. I finished my dinner. I washed the dishes. I went to bed at a reasonable hour. The following week had a specific texture that I will describe as carefully as I can, because it moved through several distinct phases, and the sequence matters. The first phase, which ran from Friday evening through Sunday, was characterized by volume. My phone received 31 missed calls across 4 family members. My Aunt Cecile sent 2 messages, both of which opened with "I don't know what's gotten into you," and proceeded from there. My mother sent a text on Saturday morning that was 4 paragraphs long and covered, in order, her confusion, her hurt, the sacrifices she and my father had made, a reference to everything they had given me, and a closing line that said, "This is not how a daughter behaves." I read it once and set the phone down. On Sunday, Daniel came to my apartment without calling first. I opened the door, and he stood in the hallway with his hands in his jacket pockets, which was a posture I recognized from childhood. It meant he was uncertain and was trying not to show it. He said he needed to understand what I actually wanted. I told him to come in. We sat at my kitchen table. I made coffee because it gave both of us something to do with our hands. Daniel sat across from me and looked at the table surface for a moment, and then looked up and said, "Are you trying to take the house back?" I said, "I never gave it. It's been in my name for 4 years. I've been carrying the mortgage for 4 years. I covered the down payment from my own savings. The only thing that changed on Friday is that Dad received a document confirming what was always true." He said, "He didn't know it was this formal." I said, "He knew the property was in my name." I told him that in 2020, when we structured the arrangement. He said it seemed fine. Daniel looked at the table again. His jaw was set in the way it set when he was doing arithmetic he didn't like. He said he thought it was just a family thing, not a legal thing. I said, "All property ownership is a legal thing, Daniel. That's what ownership means." He didn't have an answer to that. He sat with it for a moment and then said, "What do you need? What would make this? What do you need from us?" I looked at him across the table. He was my brother. He had sent a thumbs up to a message that said I was not family anymore. He was also the person sitting across from me at 9:30 on a Sunday morning, hands around a coffee mug, genuinely uncertain, genuinely trying to find a resolution. Both of these things were true simultaneously. I said, "I need Dad to call Margaret and acknowledge the tenancy terms in writing. That's the practical answer." He said, "And the other answer?" I said, "I'll let you know when I finish working it out." He nodded. He finished the coffee. He left without pushing. My father called Margaret Osei on Monday morning at 9:54. I know this because Margaret sent me a brief summary afterward. as we had agreed. She told me the call lasted 18 minutes. My father had asked several questions about the formal tenancy structure, about the legal implications of a month-to-month arrangement, about what happened to the property in various scenarios. He had been, Margaret reported, composed throughout. He had not raised his voice. At the end of the call, he asked what the process was for formalizing the acknowledgement she had requested. She told him. He said he would consult with someone and call back. He called back on Wednesday. He had, apparently, spoken with his own attorney, a man named Robert Holler, who handled wills and property matters for several families in my parents' neighborhood. Robert Holler had reviewed the situation and confirmed, apparently with some specificity, the legal structure that Margaret's letter had outlined. My father had then called Margaret and agreed to sign the written acknowledgement. The signed document arrived at Margaret's office on Friday, exactly 1 week after she had sent the original letter. She forwarded me a copy. My father's signature was at the bottom, alongside Robert Holler's notation that he had reviewed the document on behalf of the signatory. I looked at the signature for a long moment. My father's handwriting was the same as it had always been, precise, slightly compressed, each letter formed deliberately. The same handwriting that had signed my school permission forms my childhood. The same person. I filed the document in the property folder I kept on my laptop. Then I opened a new entry in my plain text document and typed the date and a single line, acknowledgement signed. My father called me directly for the first time in the proper sense, meaning not in a state of emergency, not as a fourth attempt after 3 others had gone unanswered, on a Thursday evening 3 weeks later. I picked up. He said my name. Then he said, "I have been thinking about what I wrote in that chat."
He paused.
"It was wrong." I said, "I know you've been thinking about it." He said, "I don't have a good explanation for it. There are some things I have been doing for a long time that I have been looking at more carefully since all of this." Robert Holler said some things to me that I didn't expect him to say. About the arrangement. About what it means for one person in a family to carry something that everyone else uses without understanding the weight of it. I listened. He said, "I didn't treat you fairly. For a long time. I want you to know that I understand that." I said, "I hear you." He said, "Is that enough for now?" I said, "It's a beginning." He said, "Okay." And then, after a pause that had something tentative in it, "How is your work going?" I told him, briefly, factually, as I might describe the weather. He listened. He asked one follow-up question. It was the first time in longer than I could easily calculate that my father had asked a follow-up question about my work. We spoke for 11 minutes. When we ended the call, I sat at my kitchen table for a while, without doing anything in particular. Then I opened my laptop and updated the document. The formal tenancy arrangement has been in place now for 8 months. The written lease Margaret drafted runs 12 months, with standard renewal terms. The monthly amount has been adjusted to current market rate, which my parents accepted after Robert Holler confirmed it was in line with the neighborhood. The mortgage continues to be carried by me. The equity continues to accumulate in my name. Daniel and I have had 4 conversations since the Sunday morning coffee. They are careful conversations. Neither of us is pretending that what happened didn't happen, and neither of us is certain yet what the longer version of this looks like. Elena and I have not spoken directly. I have sent one gift for Sophie and received a brief thank you from Daniel on her behalf. My mother and I have found a narrow channel of communication that involves practical subjects, a question about a recipe, a photograph texted without much context, a brief call on a birthday. We have not discussed the group chat directly. I do not know if we will. I have left room for it, and I am not pushing the door. My Aunt Cecile sent me a message in April saying she hoped things had calmed down and that family was important. I read it and did not reply. This felt like the correct decision. What I have come to understand, in the months since my father's signature appeared at the bottom of a legal document on a Friday afternoon, is that power inside a family rarely disappears. It just goes unnamed. For 4 years I held a specific form of it. The deed, the mortgage, the monthly transfer, the phone number of an attorney kept current in my contacts. None of this was visible at Sunday dinners. None of it was acknowledged at the table where I ate food that was prepared in a kitchen in a house that I owned while my father described my brother's business with the satisfaction of a man whose investments were paying off. I named it. That is all I did. I caused a document to be sent on a Friday morning that said, in formal language, what had always been true. And in doing so, I did not destroy anything that was real. I only made visible what had been invisible by mutual agreement. Theirs and mine. What belongs to you does not require an audience to be real. It requires only that you know it, maintain the records, and be willing, when the moment comes, to let it speak in its own language. I am still learning when to speak and when to wait. I think that is probably permanent. But I have the document. And I know what is in my name. Before you go, on the Thursday evening my father called and said I have been thinking about what I wrote and then asked about my work for the first time in years. What would you have said back to him? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you, please like and subscribe. There are more here, and I want to keep telling them. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for being here.